Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. First, of course, I want to express very sincere and heartfelt gratitude for the organizers of this event who've been working so hard as volunteers to make this happen. Thank you very much. I've been staying with several of them, and I'm seeing them getting up super early, constantly doing work while I'm up there drinking wine in the rainforest, going to the beach, and things like that, wine tasting, whatever. So I feel a little bit guilty. So I really want to express that to you. Thank you so much. I have offered to help, but thank God they didn't, accept it. I'm going to talk briefly about how I got involved in these issues and about the National Coalition for Men, because I think it's important for people to get an understanding of who they are and a little bit of their history and some of the things we've done. And then I'm going to focus more on one particular lawsuit that we did. I mean, we've done so much, but there's one particular lawsuit that I did in California that I think is really important for us to understand, because I think it can be used as a prototype for other lawsuits in not just other states, not just at the federal level in Los Angeles, but in other countries, and even at the international level, like the things we're seeing in India. The others may not be done the exact same way, but I think it's really important to challenge, first, the areas of the law that explicitly discriminate against men. First of all, it's easier because you don't really have to prove it's discriminatory. It's right there. And secondly, you can't really change other things in that field unless you change the law, because all the people do is just keep referring to that discriminatory law, and that's their excuse for discriminating. So there's a number of reasons why I think it's important to do that. I got involved in these issues as a law student in 1998, and I talk about it a little bit in the Red Pill, but I was a law student, and my best friend, who I grew up with, was, he and his wife drink too much, and they have 3 minor children, but he's a happy drunk, sings songs and gets annoying, but doesn't hit anybody. She, on the other hand, and I like her, she's my friend, but when she's drunk, she has a side that comes out sometimes that's extremely violent. And I've seen it. I've been there. One time she even punched me when she was slitting her wrist, and I tried to talk her out of it. Breaking glass, throwing things at him, punching him, kicking him, you name it. Trying to stab him with a knife, sometimes hitting him in his sleep. And he's a big guy. This is one of those situations, which is not all of them, but where he's a lot bigger than her, a lot stronger than her, could hurt her badly if he hit her, but he won't. And he tries to get away, goes outside so the neighbors know it's not him. But there's kids involved. And so sometimes he'll call her mom, his wife's mom, parents to come and get the kids. But then he's stuck there, and he would call me. And I was a law student. I didn't have time to keep helping him out. So eventually I said, you need help, and you need a place to bring these kids where they're safe. They need help. You need not only a shelter, but you need counseling and legal help and things like that. And you need to get out of this because it's going to escalate. And I called one night when it was really bad. I called the hotlines, the domestic violence shelters, and I got the same story more or less from everywhere. Some of them flat out said, we don't know anyone who helps male victims at all. This is in L.A. And others would say, yes, there is a shelter that helps men, and it's in Lancaster. For those of you who know where that is, that's about an hour north of L.A., way out in the desert over the Grapevine. It's still L.A. County, but way on the northern edge. And somewhere where he's not going to go, where his kids need to go to school. And by the time they even got back to me about that, it was too late. I think it was early morning. But that got me wondering why that is. I had once read a book when I was a student at Berkeley by Ellis Coase called A Man's World, How Real is Male Privilege and How High is the Price. And he talks about Warren Farrell. And I hadn't read about that. I didn't become an activist, but I'd read about it. And this made me curious again why this is happening. It made me angry. Because if I could get him help, these kids wouldn't be continuously being subjected to this violence. And we know that it's a cycle, an intergenerational cycle. These are kids who call me Uncle Mark. I started making calls. I started researching more and more, looking online, calling around. I found this movement, the men's rights movement. I found this organization called the National Coalition for Men, which I'll talk briefly about. But one of the other things I found was that I talked to people at that shelter. It's called Valley Oasis. And what they had is, it's not a men's shelter. It's a shelter that had at that time about 11 or 13 houses, all grouped up in one area, in one big lot, with like an administrative building. And what I learned happened was that in the 80s, way back in the 80s, a woman named Patricia Overberg, who's now deceased, she was like the LA version of Erin Pizzey, and you all know who Erin Pizzey is. She was the director at that time, and she was getting men coming from all over. And she decided, we have to help these guys. And she told her staff, from now on, we're setting aside one house for male victims. And she retrained her staff, she made all these changes, and she started taking men in. And if they ever had a problem like overflow in either direction, they would ask the consent of the victims, either in the women's or the men's, and say, do you mind if this person stays here? We're overflowing. And she had never had a problem with that. The only problem that she had was how the other shelters started treating her for doing that. They were furious at her. And in fact, in particular, it was 3 or 4 of them, not all of them, that were so mad because of their ideology that they would abuse her. They would ostracize her. When she would show up at the conference meetings, they would ostracize her, do all kinds of little political things to sabotage her. When she spoke out about the need to help male victims, they would refuse to put her comments in the minutes. She wrote me a sworn declaration that's on the NCFM website that I've used in a lawsuit, and it's very powerful to read that declaration. She was like an Erin Pizzey in a way, and in fact, I know there are more than just her. There are little Erin Pizzeys all over the place. But she was like a hero to me in a way, and I hadn't even heard of Erin Pizzey yet. And she told me, Mark, we need a civil rights lawsuit. That's what we need. And she was very tough, so she put up with their abuse, but she had to make a complaint with the LA County supervisors about it. So I remembered that all this time, that's what we need. But in the meantime, I wanted to do something while I was still a law student. So I started reading Warren Farrell's books. I joined the National Coalition for Men. I started publishing articles in the U.C.L.A. Daily Bruin and in the U.C.L.A. Law School newspaper called The Docket on not just this issue, but on men's rights issues altogether, because now I'm learning about father's custody issues and all kinds of things. And I had already been an activist. I had founded the Disability Law Society at U.C.L.A. Law and the Environmental Affairs Committee, so a lot of my friends were progressives, and they had mixed reactions to this men's rights stuff. As you can imagine, I mean, some of them didn't like it at all, and some of them were supportive, but they generally would be quiet about it. I had a feminist friend come to me and say, Mark, I understand what you're writing about. You want equal rights. You believe in it. You just think that men need it at least as much. I get it. She said, I just want you to know there's a lot of reactionaries out there. And 20 years later, yeah, it still rings true when I see these silly protests and violent things they do and these lies that they spread. She's still absolutely right. I tried to arrange a debate between a feminist professor and Warren Farrell. I met with this professor. She just refused. She said, no, I don't want to spread that kind of stuff. I don't want to promote that. That's misogyny. And she had no interest at all. I started speaking out in my criminal law class about how they only talked about sentencing disparities by race but not by gender. I just did everything I could, and I felt very marginalized and alone, not socially, but sort of politically, because neither the right nor left were really that supportive of these things. More or less here and there a little, but not much. Thankfully, by then, people knew me enough, so they couldn't really attack me very much. I was involved in a lot of other things. But after law school, my first job was with a nonprofit doing mental health services to people with mental disabilities, legal services for them for free. But I also formed the Los Angeles chapter of the National Coalition for Men. I called them. I said, look, I want to start a chapter. They knew me already. They gave me the list of their members in the area. I held a meeting at Glenn Sachs' house, for those of you who remember him. And it went well, and I was the president for 10 years. And during those 10 years, we did so many things. There's no way I could talk about them all. We held street rallies. We were in film screenings where we were on panels. We spoke at universities. I have some favorite stories that I could tell about them, but I don't think I have enough time, to be honest, and I don't want to I don't want to cut into that time. But the things that I was most proud of were the lawsuits, and the things that Patricia Overberg told me was what stayed in my head. NCFM, just briefly, I want to mention something about them before I talk about those lawsuits. NCFM was founded in the year 1997, and originally they were a group of men in Baltimore, in Maryland, in the United States, the state of Maryland, who were part of feminist men's conferences. But they disagreed, or some of them were part of them, and they started disagreeing with these feminist men. They agreed that gender roles were too restrictive, we need to be more flexible, but they didn't agree with the anti-male rhetoric and the oppressor-oppressed model and all that type of stuff. And they started saying, well, we have discrimination against us too, and we have a lot of issues. So they left and they formed a group called Free Men. And the word free was intended to be a verb. So, like freeing men from different forms of discrimination and gender-based pressures and things like that. That's why I've titled the speech, Freeing Men Through Activism. It partly has to do with that. Eventually, they changed it. They grew. They changed it to Coalition of Free Men, and then it became National Coalition of Free Men. And now, a few years back, they changed it to National Coalition for Men, keeping the same acronym. But they've done quite a lot. They're just not, their activism going back to the 70s isn't that known, but there's some old pictures of things they did, and I've saved a few of them if you can see this well enough, and if you can still hear me using this other mic. Well, it's kind of dark, but they did this big conference back in 1991 that was packed at Adelphi University in New York. And I guess you can't see these too well, but their vice president was a woman, this tough-talking New York woman. And right here, second from your left is Fred Hayward from the Red Pill, the one with the white hair who told a long story about his kids. That's him. He was involved going way back. And just so those of you who don't know this, at the L.A. premiere of the Red Pill, he was with his son. He had reunited with his son a few years back. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I was hoping you would clap because that's how I feel about it. Here he was reunited with him, watching the film with him. And this, who you can't see too well either, is the actor, the late actor and choreographer and dancer Gregory Hines, for those who know him. Actor Ed Asner was also a member. And I don't know who that is. But they did a lot of things. Some of the earlier things they did were to sue the airports, some major airports in New York, and get them to put diaper-changing tables into the men's restrooms, too. Things like that. It was really interesting. And they went on for years and years, sometimes less active than others. But it's a very chapter-based organization. So the chapters, it's member-based. There's a membership fee. And the chapters do what they want. So some of them, like in the Twin Cities, they focus on tabling. And others focus on sort of like support groups and helping men get through the grief and the problems of family courts. In L.A., we did so many things, it was unbelievable. But we really were known more for our lawsuits. Here's a picture of Aaron Pizzey, only because Patricia Overberg is our Aaron Pizzey. And because I just learned that I'm taking the slot of Aaron Pizzey since she can't be here. So in honor of her, I think I ought to show her wonderful pictures. What an amazing person she is. Thank you. That's right. I'll clap for her too. this is Patricia Overberg, who described herself as a tough old broad. And she's our hero in L.A., you know, just as much as Aaron and Warren Farrell and as anyone else. But we knew her personally. We loved her. This is the link to her sworn declaration online, and I'm not going to go there because I don't have time, but you can always look it up or ask me. Here's one of our rallies for those of you who remember maybe 4 or 5 years ago when Verizon spread that commercial out there that was very dad-bashing and said that when children witness domestic violence, the males will grow up to be batterers and the girls will grow up to be victims. Well, there was a protest among MRAs all over, and we did this rally right in front of the Verizon in Santa Monica. And it was very effective. We got into local news and things like that, and it did force a change. Because, of course, they reported to headquarters, and there were others who were doing this in other parts of the nation and the world, in fact. This is one of our paternity fraud rallies outside the courthouse. We worked with lots of paternity fraud victims. So we did a lot of things like this. We even disrupted a feminist legislator's award banquet because she had been fighting us so much, very fiercely, in paternity fraud, and we learned she was being given an award, so we broke. Her name was Sheila. Sheila Kuehl. And we barged in there with signs chanting, "Shame on Sheila, shame on Sheila." And it was fun, you know. Sometimes they call the cops on us and things. But we really had a brotherhood, and we had women with us too, and it was really a bonding experience. I think we need more of that throughout the world, this type of organizing and activism together. It's very effective. We published tons of letters to the editor in the newspapers, a few op-eds too. We did everything you can imagine. But before I go there, all that time though, that lawsuit was in the back of my mind. And it took some research to figure out what approach to take. I had never filed lawsuits like that before. I didn't have any help. And I was doing all of this pro bono, separate from my employment, which makes it hard because it's nights and weekends, with not a lot of help, especially not legal help. But, of course, the first thing we did was did the research on the statistics. And I don't want to go too much into this kind of stuff, but we all know that in the United States, for a long time, what the other side was doing in citing statistics was always to say, well, we need to stick with the federal statistics. Because for a long time, the only federal statistics were from crime agencies, from the Department of Justice. And that means either crime reports, police reports, which we know are very biased because men don't report as much as women, but also randomized surveys done by the Department of Justice, which are also biased because even though they're randomized, they're done in the context of crime, using crime language. And they ask questions about all kinds of crimes, not just domestic violence. When you talk about it like that, you make men much less likely to respond positively. You lower the number of both male and female victims, but then you create this false disparity because the men are much less likely to see it as a crime when they're victimized because we haven't educated them to see it that way. So that's what they always cited, even though we had, as a lot of you know, the bibliography by Professor Martin Fiebert on his website at Cal State L.A. that had hundreds of studies showing that men and women initiate the violence at the same rates. But there's that caused a lot of problems because they drag you away from what the point you're making into this argument about self-defense and all these other statistical arguments, and you get lost in that battle. Eventually, the Centers for Disease Control, a federal agency, did a national survey. And they came out. About 1 in 3 women and more than 1 in 3 men in the U.S. have experienced different forms of intimate partner violence. And when it comes to more severe forms, it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men. Now, that's not exactly equal, but so what? This was good enough to shut them up when they say we need federal stats. This is a federal stat. It's a federal agency doing this. So I tend to just start with this, and I often don't even go into the other things. I don't know if Australia has something like this. If they don't, then use what you have. You don't have to prove that it's equal. The fact is there are male victims. if you're using only police reports or whatever you have, you can always explain that, these are conservative numbers because men are less likely to report or whatever, but you still have those numbers. And I recommend not getting too distracted by statistical arguments. But this is what we found, and of course the Associated Press did a report on this story and never gave the male victims, only the female victims. So you can still find that online. It's amazing, and you know that's intentional. Now, this is just, I'm going to jump past this, but this is where some of the other data is on the, the equal initiation. Not necessarily equal amounts of physical damage. We know that. On average, men are causing more physical damage. But women are causing physical damage using weapons, surprise, all kinds of things. There are men in wheelchairs, disabled men, all kinds of reasons. But then, of course, there's the damage to children, like my friend, which is really, in my opinion, the biggest damage because it's part of the cycle. And then whenever they start retorting that men are causing more damage, more murders and all that, they're completely ignoring the children and the cycle. It's just amazing how they'll do that. But this is what we found next as we researched, that the state law in California explicitly discriminated against men. I mean, we went up the ladder. We started meeting at the L.A. County Domestic Violence Council meetings and going to their committee meetings and talking about these things. And we made a few allies, but there was so much hostility to it that ultimately we didn't make changes. And when we researched, this one we came up with, Health and Safety Code 124250. It rung in my head for 7 years. And you can see when we compare it to New York's statute, it's completely different. California's was gender specific, New York's was not. There are some states that are also gender specific and some that aren't. I don't know why New York did it this way, but it seems much more fair. And so we realized, okay, what we need, since this is government discrimination and it's explicit, we need to challenge it constitutionally. And then the question was, do we challenge it in the federal courts or in the state courts? Which one? Because California has its own constitution. And under what clause? Well, of course, it would be the Equal Protection Clause. In the federal constitution, the 14th Amendment contains a clause that says, and this is only the end of the clause. The beginning of it talks about how all persons born in the U.S. are U.S. citizens. But it ends by saying, nor shall any state, so again, this is talking about states, it's not the federal government, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Okay? The California Constitution has something very similar. But we had to do our research, and we also had to find plaintiffs. And we tried one lawsuit that didn't work because we only used what were called civil rights testers. We had trouble finding male victims who were willing to put their names out there and be in the public as battered men. So we used what are called civil rights testers. The housing department and fair employment departments use testers where they take a white and a black person or different races and they falsify their credentials and they apply for jobs or for housing and they see whether there's systematic discrimination. And the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that testers have standing to sue if they're discriminated against. It's just that they can't get they can't get monetary damages, but they can sue for injunctive relief to put a stop to it. And maybe there's some nominal damages. So we used civil rights testers initially, and that's when I learned how important it is in men's rights activism to use plaintiffs who are sympathetic, who have an actual story, because the backlash was so strong from the media and everywhere else, because no one would sympathize with these testers since they didn't really need the services at the time. And we ultimately didn't win, even though the law, I believe, was on our side, that the U.S. Supreme Court says testers have standing. These courts ruled that they don't for purposes of the statutes we were suing under. That was just, it was mind-blowing, but we learned a good lesson from that. So after that, we took 4 male victims from different parts of California. One of them was in a wheelchair and had been battered by his wife. Or another one had mental disabilities, and in fact, while the case was pending, he committed suicide. And the main plaintiff was named, and all of them had been denied services. I won't go there yet. The main plaintiff was named David Woods, and I'll show you a picture of him down further on the slides. But he was from Sacramento, and his wife had been very violent to him for a long time, punching, kicking. He was an ex-bouncer, so he was really strong, but he knew if he hit his wife, he could kill her. And he had minor children, too, witnessing it. So he would just take it. And one day he called the local shelter there in Sacramento, called WEAVE, Women Escaping Violent Environments, and they just said, no, we don't take men, we don't help men. So, and one time his daughter even called for him, and they told her no. So we had to decide, are we suing in federal court or not? And what we learned, and some of this I already knew from law school. What we learned is that the Equal Protection Clause in the U.S., for a long time, it was enacted in the mid-1800s after the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. After they abolished slavery, there were the black codes in the South that had all kinds of laws that discriminated against blacks. So they enacted the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, largely for that purpose. And it actually sat dormant for a long time. The first landmark case was in the late 1800s regarding voting rights for blacks. And then came cases like Brown versus Board of Education in the 50s that ended racial discrimination. And so the civil rights movement was the movement that initially picked up on the Equal Protection Clause. But then lots of others were using it too. And the courts started finding themselves a little confused because what does equal protection really mean? It sounds simple, right? But what about, for instance, when we give driver's license we require someone to be 16 before they have a driver's license, or 21 before they can drink alcohol? Is that equal protection? There are all kinds of areas where we actually don't treat people equally. So what do? And over time, the courts developed this, what they call equal protection analysis, where certain classifications, like race, had what they call strict scrutiny, if it was, remember, this is only regarding the law or government actions, and others, like sex discrimination, had more intermediate type scrutiny, and others had less scrutiny. So let's suppose the law discriminated by race, like segregation or something. If somebody sued to end that in a certain state, or a subdivision of state, which can be a county or a city, the question would be, first, are these two people, is the person being discriminated against equally, similarly situated with someone of a different race who's not? And if so, is the classification narrowly tailored to a compelling government interest? So it really, if it's race-based, the scrutiny is strict or it's not going to pass. And so essentially what that means is it has to be necessary. And one example of where race discrimination did pass the test was when there's a prison riot based on race, and they had to separate the races to stop the riot. So there are some examples where race discrimination did pass strict scrutiny, but most of the times it did not. Well, with gender, or I should say sex, they decided it's perhaps not as bad of a thing, and I'm sure they had the military draft in mind, but they made it intermediate scrutiny. So the classification must be carefully tailored to an important government interest. It doesn't have to be absolutely necessary, but it has to be, important and kind of carefully tailored to that. And of course, it's up to the courts to decide whether that applies. And for anything else, anything that isn't listed, any of the classifications that aren't listed by the courts, they would fall under rational basis, and that can be almost anything else. Somebody suing an entity that requires only people of a certain age in order to live there or something like that. And that just means any rational basis at all for the discrimination, it's allowed. So we were a little concerned because we know the politics and where these courts tend to lean when it comes to men's rights, and would they use the intermediate scrutiny as an excuse, to deny our lawsuit? So that's what would happen if it was in the federal courts, okay? But if it was in the California courts, we found something very different. In California, gender, I should have said sex here, discrimination is subject to strict scrutiny. And that's the case called Honoree versus Board of Education that involved affirmative action. California, we had a big advantage suing in the state courts and not in the federal courts. On the other hand, the federal courts tend to be more objective. And usually I would suggest you sue in the federal courts. They're less tied to the local politics, and they're more likely to be objective, at least from what I've seen. But in a case like this, where there's a major difference in the type of scrutiny the law is going to face, the discrimination will face, I think it was best to sue in state courts. And we sued in Sacramento because we researched the appellate decisions of the different courts, because we knew it was going to wind up in an appellate court. And we chose Sacramento as the one that's most likely to side with us. They decided the Honoree decision and that kind of thing. So we kept it in the state courts. And we sued the state of California and on behalf of these 4 victims and the daughter of one of them, the daughter of David Woods. And we sued the shelter in Sacramento, which, by the way, got $4 million a year, $2 million from private sources, $2 million from state sources. And we pretty much sued only those 2 entities. And right when we filed it, it got into the local media in Sacramento, and they actually did a really good story. It's no longer online, or I would show it to you. But, that's David Woods, but I'm sorry, it's too dark. I'm not very tech savvy, so it's my fault, and I apologize. But this was like a 5-year battle, this whole thing. I mean, from the beginning of these lawsuits to the end. What happened was, here's an interesting thing, though. While the case was pending, well, first I should start with the lower court. The judge in the lower court was sympathetic to us. And he said, I've had battered men in my courtroom. He was sympathetic. But he ruled against us, to my surprise. And his reasoning was in the ruling that, well, more women than men need these services, and therefore, men and women are not similarly situated. And so you don't even ask the scrutiny question at all because they're not similarly situated. Now, that's clearly flawed. If you remember, the Equal Protection Clause, both in California and the federal, says persons, not groups. So it doesn't matter if you're the minority or not. It applies to you. I really believe that his reasoning was he was afraid that if he sided with us, he would have to invalidate the whole statute. But it's not true. I showed him there's something in the case law called Judicial Reformation, where if the judge feels, if there's evidence in the legislative history that the legislature would have preferred the statute to be reformed and made neutral and constitutional rather than being obliterated, then the judge can reform it and keep it intact, but simply reform it to be neutral. And he just didn't listen to me. So we appealed it the very next day. And while it was on appeal, an interesting thing happened. A gay rights group called Equality California introduced legislation to do a bunch of things, but one of the things they introduced was to make this law gender neutral. And their reasoning was, if you read the history, the legislative history, they said that male victims are not getting services. But after they did that, and my response to that was, I'm glad. At the same time, I kind of want an appellate victory here for my own reasons. I think it would be more impactful, and it probably will get more media. And I want a men's rights victory. When I overturn it, and I love appeals. When I overturn a judge's decision, I celebrate for a month. I'm so happy. So, but I was glad they're doing it. So I watched, and what happened was the shelters did a whole outcry. They had an outcry, and they told that group, put it back. And they had a massive letter campaign writing to the subcommittees of the legislature saying, don't do this. We oppose this being changed to gender neutral. And this is what gets me when feminists tell you that they're not, that it's all patriarchy. The fault of all this discrimination against men is patriarchy, not them. It's completely untrue. This law was originally written in the 70s by groups like California National Organization for Women and groups like that. They had written it explicitly to discriminate against men. And then when a gay rights group tried to change it, they fought them. So the legislature did put it back. But that's good. It gave us an appellate victory. We did win. I argued before 3 judges. And they overturned that lower court judge, all 3 of them. And one of the 3 judges, I think it was the main one who wrote the decision, is a woman who now is the Supreme Court Justice of California. And I like her. Yeah. A Filipino woman. And now the language of the decision wasn't as hard-hitting as I would like, but there's a few things that I think are significant that can still be used. The case is Woods versus Horton. It's still on there. You can look it up on the internet. Domestic violence is a serious problem for both men and women. Men experience significant levels of domestic violence as victims. The discrimination carries the baggage of sexual stereotypes. And, that they are similarly situated. They agree with me that the equal protection protects persons, individuals, not groups. So you can't say, well, you're in the minority, so it doesn't apply to you. As a result of this, there were changes. We reached a settlement with the shelter in Sacramento. It's a confidential settlement. Before the decision, we settled with them, and I can't talk about it. But the one thing I can tell you is what they did. They made massive changes. They created a program for male victims, classes for male victims. They invited our experts to come and retrain their staff. It was amazing what they did. And this got, thank you. And this got media attention all the way to Scotland. I had a reporter from Scotland call me and say, we have the same problem here. But it's not over. Not at all. Now, after you overturn a statute and make it gender neutral, either legislatively or by having it declared illegal, which we did, and we would have never changed it legislatively. If a gay rights group can't do it, the men's rights group can't do it. But after that happens, of course, there's the issue of implementation. But having done this, we had a victory, and the message was spread that you can be sued if you're not at least giving men a hotel voucher. Maybe the shelter is so small. Some of these shelters are big enough in dormitory style that they can mix genders. But some are so small that I guess there's the argument that they can't. It's debatable, but at least I think it's a legitimate argument. Well, you could at least give hotel vouchers, because that's listed in the statute as one of the forms of services that you can give. But what we're finding now is that some counties are interpreting the language, because the language said, if you can't provide a hotel, if you can't provide residential services, you can do alternative things such as hotel vouchers. Well, some counties are interpreting that to mean, okay, so we can provide alternative things. So as long as we give a referral to Valley Oasis, or a place that does help men, or try to help them, we've done something. That's how some of them are interpreting this. So I believe we need another lawsuit in time. And we are looking into that. And we have one pending right now against the Selective Service, and that was actually revived. We won at the federal level, the Court of Appeal, so that's pending right now. And I'm out of time. You're welcome to ask me about that if you want. There's so many things I'd like to talk about, but I just can't. Thank you, though, very much.
We have five minutes.
I'm sorry? By the way, while he's walking over there, another thing I want to point out is if you've exhausted all your remedies in your country, you can try to go to the United Nations Human Rights Court, because MRAs in both Israel have been effective in that, and also in Germany for the European Union Human Rights Court. But I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to ask you about selective service.
Oh, okay.
And how does that affect voting rights in America?
Yeah. Well, a few years ago, we took a young man who's about 20 of draft age, who's required to register. If men in the U.S. don't register, they can be thrown in jail, they can be fined, they can be denied student loans and grants and things like that. So, and women, of course, are not subjected to that. And we don't take a position officially whether there ought to be draft registration or not. All we want is to end the discrimination. And by the way, the draft does not have to be about combat. If you look at the Selective Service website, in World War II, they almost drafted women as nurses. But the only reason they didn't, it says, is that there were enough volunteer nurses. So we oppose sex discrimination against men, and that's something we decided to sue them on. There already was a decision in the Supreme Court called Roster versus Goldberg I think in 81, where this group of men sued similarly, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, but they found, under intermediate scrutiny, that men and women were not similarly situated because women were not allowed in combat. Now, to some extent, that makes sense, and to some extent, it doesn't, right? Because it doesn't have to be about combat. But that was the ruling, and there was a vigorous dissent from Justice Thurgood Marshall and three judges dissented. It was the court was split. What happened a few years ago changed everything when the military and the Department of Defense announced we're now going to allow women in all combat roles. That was a slow change over time. They started allowing women in combat roles long ago, in different roles here and there. But now they're announcing they're going to allow them in all combat roles. So the one purpose, one excuse for not not siding with the plaintiffs in the Roster case was that women weren't allowed in combat. That has changed. So we sued. Our plaintiff was a young man and the National Coalition for Men. And the judge initially threw it out on the ground that the case is not ripe. And her reasoning, and she was pretty hostile, I'll tell you that. Her reasoning was that, well, the military may have announced that they're going to allow women in combat roles, but they haven't done it yet. And so we don't really know what's going to happen. It's true, there was still some research to do, some reports to submit, and all that. But they had announced they're going to do it. But that was her ruling. It's not ripe yet. That doesn't mean she ruled against us on the merits. It means our lawsuit was premature. But we still appealed it because we think she was wrong. And on appeal, we won. It got reversed by all three judges in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. And we were very happy about that. And in fact, those judges indicated that they kind of side with us. Kind of hinted in their language. So it got reversed, and it got transferred to Texas for various procedural reasons that are kind of complicated. We have a motion pending now asking to transfer it back to California and things like that. So right now it's kind of pending. It's stuck. It's being delayed by motions, and it will be delayed for a while. We found that there is another similar lawsuit in New York, in the East Coast, filed by a woman. In fact, it's the National Institute for Men that filed that on behalf of a woman who is claiming she's discriminated against because she can't register for the draft. And we're glad about that. I mean, you take whatever you want from that, but that's fine. And we've let the courts know that these two cases are pending. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm pretty hopeful. I think we have a very good shot. I mean, I don't know what their reasoning is. I can't imagine what their reasoning would be. The one problem is if it stays in Texas, the court there may be less likely to side with us than in California. But I still think we have a winning case. And we're going to keep fighting, just like all the other things we're doing. And that's what I encourage everybody to do. And so many of you have been, and I'm so thankful to all of you, everything you've done. It's just amazing to be here. I remember 20 years ago how little activity there was. There was always some, but this is just incredible what's happening, and we're growing and growing like crazy. We're growing all over the world. I'm serious. Seriously. In Costa Rica, they just got the president to promise he'll create a commission on men's rights, or on men's issues. Things like that we're reading about all over the place. So I'll stop. I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
Mark, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Marc Angelucci.